What if I told you that one of the brightest physicists of the 20th century boarded a ferry one night and was never seen again? His theories are still shaking quantum labs today, but his life ended in a mystery so deep that even the FBI once chased his ghost across continents. This is Singularity Animations, where we dive into history's strangest crossroads between genius and mystery. And today, you're about to hear the chilling stories of 6 brilliant minds who didn't just fade away, they disappeared. Some walked into the wilderness and never returned. Some left only cryptic letters. And one, the most fascinating case of all, you'll meet at the very end of this film. So, if you believe the past still has secrets left to teach us, then stay with me. And before we begin, make sure you subscribe to Singularity Animations, because the stories we tell here aren't just facts. They re the lost futures of humanity, and you won't want to miss the next one. When an ordinary person disappears, we mourn the life. But when a genius vanishes, we mourn something larger. The inventions that never happened, the books never written, the equations never solved. It's as if a door to a brighter future was slammed shut. That's why these stories feel so haunting. They aren't just mysteries. They're tragedies about potential cut short, and yet they're also addictive to hear. Because part of us wonders, what if they survived? What if they're out there, somewhere, still creating? Let us begin with one of the most painful and least talked about stories. A mathematician who turned away from the world, and in doing so, left behind a silence louder than any theorem. Alexander Grothendieck, the mathematician who walked away in the 1960s. Alexander Grothendieck wasn't just another professor. He was rewriting the entire language of modern mathematics. To his colleagues, he was a Mozart of abstraction, creating entire symphonies of geometry and chalk. And then, he left. Disillusioned with the scientific establishment, disgusted by its ties to nuclear weapons research, Grothendieck retreated to the Pyrenees Mountains in southern France. He cut off nearly all contact with friends and students. Decades of unpublished notes filled his small home, but he refused prizes and shunned recognition. It was as if a star had gone supernova in silence. His disciples begged him to return, but he never did. He died in 2014. Still in isolation, leaving behind thousands of handwritten pages that scholars are only now beginning to unravel. Grothendieck didn't vanish in body, but in spirit. He did, and that's what makes his story terrifying. A genius who deliberately erased himself. Vladimir Alexandrov, a Cold War scientist who never came home. Now let's jump to the 1980s, a time when the fear of nuclear war hung over every headline. Vladimir Alexandrov was a Soviet physicist whose models of nuclear winter shook policymakers across the globe. In 1985, he attended a scientific conference in Madrid. He gave a lecture, had drinks with colleagues, and then gone. No trace, no body, no clear explanation. Some said he defected, others believed the KGB dragged him back to Moscow. Still others whispered the CIA may have silenced him to suppress his work. But in truth, nobody knows. Here was a scientist whose ideas could have changed how nations prepared for nuclear disaster. Erased in a single night. Imagine the tension in that hotel lobby. Colleagues checking their watches, calling his room, pacing in confusion. The man who mapped the apocalypse had slipped into his own. Barbara Newhall-Follett, the child genius who vanished into thin air. Not every lost genius is a man in a lab coat. Some are children who lit the world with their talent before life dimmed the flame. Barbara Newhall-Follett was a literary prodigy. At 12, she published her first novel, a book critics hailed as astonishing. She was called a child wonder, destined for greatness. But success in childhood didn't shield her from heartbreak. By her mid-20s, her marriage was collapsing. Depression stalked her. One cold night in 1939, after an argument with her husband, she walked out of her Boston apartment and never returned. No body, no farewell. Just a trail of unanswered questions. Her husband waited weeks before reporting her missing. Her mother never stopped searching. Some whispered she faked her death to begin a new life. Others believe her body lies in an unmarked grave. For readers who loved her first book, the thought that her pen fell silent forever is unbearable. A voice that could have shaped American literature simply disappeared into the night. Ludwig Leichhardt. The explorer swallowed by the continent in the 19th century. Australia was still a vast and unmapped wilderness. Into that wilderness rode Ludwig Leichhardt, a German-born explorer, naturalist, and scientist. In 1848, he set out with a team to cross Australia from east to west. A journey thousands of kilometers across deserts and savannas. And then, nothing. His entire party vanished. Years later, fragments began to appear. A tree marked with his initials. A brass plate from his gear. Buttons scattered across the outback. But the full truth, still missing. Some say they perished in the desert. Others argue they integrated with indigenous communities and abandoned their colonial mission. A few even believe Leichhardt made it to the other side of the continent and simply chose anonymity. In Australia today, his disappearance is called the nation's greatest exploration mystery. A man who sought to map the continent became part of its unmapped void. Donald Cruhorst, the inventor, lost at sea in 1968. A solo sailing race promised fame and fortune to the first person who could circle the globe alone. Among the competitors was Donald Cruhorst, a weekend sailor with more confidence than experience. But Cruhorst wasn't a host, reckless. He was a tinkerer, a dreamer, a kind of garage genius. He built his own boat, packed it with experimental equipment, and set sail. Soon, reality hit. His boat was falling apart, and he was hopelessly behind. Instead of quitting, Cruhorst faked his progress, sending false position reports back to the press. On paper, he was racing brilliantly. In reality, he was drifting aimlessly in the South Atlantic. When his boat was found, it was empty. Inside were logbooks filled with rambling, philosophical musings about time, the nature of reality, and his own unraveling mind. No one knows if he threw himself into the sea or simply slipped, but what remains is the ghost of a man who tried to outwit the ocean and lost himself instead. Each of these disappearances carries its own sting. A mathematician who reached himself, a Cold War scientist swallowed by politics, a child genius gone in the night, an explorer eaten by the earth, a sailor devoured by his lies. But the next story, the one I teased at the beginning, is the most haunting of all, because this man's disappearance wasn't just personal. It left behind theories that still power the most cutting-edge labs on the planet. Ettore Majorana, the physicist who stepped into the dark Ettore Majorana, was not just brilliant. He was the kind of physicist's other geniuses called a genius, a child prodigy. He could solve cube roots in his head. In the 1930s, he worked alongside Enrico Fermi in Rome, dazzling colleagues with ideas no one else could imagine. In 1938, Majorana bought a ferry ticket from Palermo to Naples. He wrote a cryptic letter of apology to his family. And then, nothing. He vanished. No body was ever found. No definitive explanation ever surfaced. Some believed suicide. Others thought he joined a monastery, hidden in silence. Years later, alleged sightings placed him in Argentina and Venezuela, sparking speculation that he lived under a false name for decades. But here's the strangest part. The physics he left behind still matters today. Majorana particles, exotic entities that are their own antiparticles, are central to quantum computing research. Scientists in 2025 are still trying to confirm the existence of what he first imagined nearly a century ago. It is as if Majorana didn't disappear at all, but simply slipped into his own equations, haunting them from the other side of history. So what do all these stories have in common? They remind us how fragile brilliance can be. Genius doesn't guarantee protection from despair, or politics, or the unforgiving wilderness. These vanishings are like holes torn in history, doors slammed shut on futures we'll never get to see. And yet, by remembering them, by telling their stories, we keep those doors cracked open. We make sure their brilliance isn't completely lost. This is why Singularity Animations exists. To pull back the curtain on the forgotten and the mysterious, to give voice to the silence where genius once lived. If these stories moved you, then don't let them vanish again. Subscribe to Singularity Animations, join this community, and help us bring more of history's hidden geniuses back into the light. Because every time a brilliant mind disappears, humanity loses a piece of its future. But here, together, we can make sure they are never truly forgotten.